much for that introduction, and thanks to Betsy Whitehorn for inviting me, and to the Ethical Society for being here. I'm excited to talk to you today. I think the sound is all right. Yeah. I'm sorry. What should I do? Be closer? Oh, okay, I'll try. Might mess up my vision a little bit. I think I can do it. My goal today is to provide you with historical context. The historical context required to understand the situation that Puerto Rico finds itself in the 21st century, in economic crisis, ongoing economic crisis, and particularly after its devastation by two historic hurricanes in 2017, which happened to be exactly 100 years after its residents were made citizens of the US by an act of Congress. More on that in a moment. So I'm going to set up a little bit about what happened in 2017, just a very little bit. That fall, there was a statistic circulating in the US political news that only 54% of people in the US knew that Puerto Ricans are American citizens. I actually think, and I'm really not being sarcastic here, that this estimate is very optimistic, and maybe, this isn't really that sarcastic either, 54% may be closer to the proportion of US lawmakers who really understand, or at least before entering Congress, who understand that Puerto Ricans are American citizens and what their rights are. So for Puerto Ricans, both in the United States and on the island in 2017, there was a really bitter irony in analyzing the role of American citizenship, or the role that American citizenship played in the lives of Puerto Ricans throughout the previous century. Anyone paying attention to the politics of that moment, you may remember President Trump throwing paper towels at the victims of the hurricane, mocking the mayor of San Juan, who was doing a remarkable job of keeping things together and organizing disaster relief. You may have said something wrong, besides just Trump, that after the US federal government response to Puerto Rico's crises following the hurricanes, it became all the more obvious that we can't talk about Puerto Ricans and the status of Puerto Rico without addressing their status as colonial citizens. So I'll start by focusing on a few present-day issues surrounding the status question vis-a-vis the United States, and then talk a little bit more about the history. So on 7 occasions in the last 60 years, since 1967 actually, Puerto Ricans on the island have answered ballot questions, sometimes referred to as plebiscites or referenda, to express their preferences on the issue of the island's political status. The choices have ranged. Each ballot question incident has been different. The choices have ranged from, some version of it. U.S. statehood has been on the ballot each time. Sometimes full independence is on the ballot, and usually one of a variety of possibilities in between. That is, this gray area is the category into which the current Commonwealth status falls. In Spanish, the Commonwealth status is referred to as Estado Libre Asociado, associated free state, which actually, all of these are kind of mutable categories. Like, it just depends on how they are stipulated in various treaty and congressional documents. There's not some single meaning of the Commonwealth status there's lots of different kinds of Commonwealths around the world. So in any case, it's interesting that Estado Libre Asociado is a kind of different, it has different connotations than Commonwealth in English. But we can get to that a bit later. So each of these ballot initiatives on the status question have been marked by the complexities of the political moment, affected in part by which of the two major parties on the island is in power. Either basically there's a statehood party and then there's a Commonwealth party, which just did remarkably badly in the most recent election in 2024. That was kind of remarkable. And then the minority party is the Nationalist Party. The ballot initiatives, the outcomes have also been affected by whether the Nationalist Party has participated in or promoted a boycott of the ballot question, as well as the outcome is affected by procedural details like how the questions are framed. So the point is, the results of these 7 plebiscites are very hard to compare to one another, and that's one reason that the sort of tracking the politics of the status issue, especially for people from the United States who don't fully understand what the issues are, remains pretty confusing. And if the results are always unclear, which I would say they are, what might follow from those results is also extremely unclear, though a little easier to predict. It's up to the US Congress to change the current political structure. So these plebiscites are just essentially polls on people's preferences, because the people of Puerto Rico have no power to vote to do anything in relation to US lawmakers or to the US Congress. So there is one non-voting member of Congress, the US Congress, elected by the Puerto Rican people. That's called the resident commissioner. The resident commissioner can participate in committees and vote in committees, cannot vote on the House floor. So there is one single non-voting representative for 3-point-something million people on the island in the US Congress. So it's up to the US Congress to change the current political structure, and Congress has shown over and over that it's not willing to take up the question of Puerto Rico's status with any degree of seriousness. One immediate problem is that despite all the emphasis that you may have heard about the Latino vote in the last couple of decades, national political leaders here in the US have paid very little attention to the Puerto Rican electorate. A little bit recently, since the Puerto Rican population of Florida has grown substantially in the last 10, 15 years, so that part of the state's Republican versus Democrat politics have been affected a bit by that population. The number of Puerto Rican voters in the US is relatively small. It's about 10% of the total Latino vote, compared to Mexican Americans, who comprise more than 50% of that electorate. But changing the status of Puerto Rico would be is a problematic question for the US Congress for a different reason. If Puerto Rico became the 51st state of the US, it would be able to elect between 4 and 6 representatives to Congress. This is based on the population. As well as 2 senators, obviously, and would control up to 8 electoral college votes. Since Puerto Ricans on the island who do get to vote in primary elections, if you want to understand what that's about, we can talk about that later. It's strange. They vote in the primaries, they cannot vote in the presidential election. Since most Puerto Ricans on the island who vote in primaries vote Democratic, it's a pretty high stakes political question in the US Congress, actually, which is why congressional leaders just haven't dealt with it. So now for some historical perspective on what I call imperial arrogance that has produced this situation, where so few people aside from Puerto Ricans pay any attention. I'm not accusing you, you're here to learn more about this, to pay any attention to the questions of status, citizenship, and law that govern the US-Puerto Rico relationship. So I want to first talk about some origins. You probably learned at some point in high school history, or maybe something a little beyond that, about the war in 1898, which is usually still even referred to in textbooks as the Spanish-American War, which is very interesting because it was started by Cuban independence fighters, and for 10 years in the 1860s and then again in the 1890s, Cubans and their Puerto Rican counterparts who also sought independence fought against Spain. The United States entered the war for a few months in 1898, trounced the Spanish, and then named the war the Spanish-American War. Puerto Rican independentistas, allied with their Cuban counterparts who had gone to war with Spain, they greeted U.S. intervention with kind of a vague hope that the U.S. would support Puerto Ricans in their aspiration for sovereignty. There was a kind of idea that, well, the U.S. represents these principles of liberty, sovereignty, democratic rule, that must be their purpose here. That didn't turn out to be the case. There was limited sovereignty for Cubans. That's a whole other interesting story. And Puerto Rico was taken on as a territory along with Guam and the Philippines. Before Congress extended U.S. citizenship to all Puerto Ricans in 1917, so just under 2 decades after the end of the war, legal scholars and legislators had battled for almost 2 decades, off and on, over whether and how to include the people of this foreign colony in the United States. A series of legal decisions now called the Insular Cases. Most of them were decided in 1901. Some scholars include a handful of later cases in that group. But they led to a new concept in U.S. international law, and territorial law, called the unincorporated territory. Previously, all territories would become states. Eventually, it was just a kind of a question of when. This was a new situation. There were reasons that many U.S. lawmakers did not want the people of Puerto Rico to form a state. Most of those reasons were racial, or much of the language of objection to statehood or some future statehood was articulated in racial terms. I mean, this was 1915 was when the birth of the nation was screened in the White House, and so it wasn't strange to have racist terms like mongrel peoples and alien incompetence. These were quotes that were written into the congressional record. So nearly all of those who argued against building, so some of the arguments were also, in addition to racial arguments, about an objection to U.S. creating empire. We were supposed to be a democracy that had broken away from the ideas of empire in the late 18th century. So some who objected against building a new U.S. empire did so on the basis of the injustice of denying independence and sovereignty to those who wanted it, but also on the basis of arguments about racial inferiority of the island populations, particularly the Philippines and Puerto Rico. So the provisions of the Act of Congress in 1917, called the Jones-Shafroth Act, it's just usually referred to as the Jones Act, but it's a little confusing because there was a 1920 Jones Act that people talked about a bit during the hurricane catastrophe, because that act was a limitation on shipping that had to actually be changed in order for the U.S. to deliver disaster relief after the hurricanes in 1917. So this was the first Jones Act about citizenship. And the provisions of it were mostly about actually restructuring the government of Puerto Rico to give islanders some degree of local control. And citizenship was added to ensure that the U.S. Constitution, as people said at the time, followed the flag. But the form of citizenship extended to Puerto Ricans is not identical to that of people who live on the mainland. Puerto Ricans don't get to vote in federal elections. They don't pay federal income taxes, and sometimes this exchange, or this is presented as a balance. Well, yes, they have some limitations on their citizenship, but they don't have to pay income tax. Well, Puerto Ricans on the island do pay payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicaid. They pay. There are other federal taxes, so that the island of Puerto Rico every year contributes more to the federal tax base than 6 other states in the continental United States. Yet still, people hold on to this justification for them being unable to elect federal officials or have representation in Congress. So I call this governance without representation. And this was liberal democracy in the new US empire in the early 20th century. So what about the thousands of Puerto Ricans who began migrating to the US once they were granted citizenship? And around the same time, this was toward the end of World War I, and the economy was booming, the sort of industrial economy was surging again. Did their status as full citizens on the mainland mean that they were being governed with representation? Well, of course, technically, yes. They could vote in Puerto Ricans who migrated to the US, and most of them came to New York City, at least in the first couple of decades. They could vote in local, state, and national elections, but as you might imagine, their interests were largely ignored by elected representatives, first in New York. In part because, well, there was still this kind of racial distinction. Puerto Ricans were often in New York City kind of categorized with Black Americans and considered to be politically insignificant, if not dangerous. And the Puerto Rican population on the mainland was increasing at exactly the moment, this was like in the 1920s, that immigration restrictionists had effectively shut down immigration outside the Western Hemisphere. So Puerto Rican migrants' growing presence in New York was perceived as a threat by many other New Yorkers. I'll give you a quote from, in 1931, the chairman of the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization in Congress, he became alarmed by reports of an expanding Puerto Rican population on the mainland. And he asked his fellow legislators, how many know that the people of Puerto Rico, including those in the New York colony, meaning the neighborhood in New York, are already citizens? How many know that? Who knows how long it will be when these new elements shall choose to elect 3 or 4 members of the House of Representatives from their group, implying, and pursue their political goals, and what would that mean? This isn't right, was the implication. So in this context, and this was, of course, in the early 1930s, this was an era of the Great Depression, which intensified the sense of kind of competition and the racist discourse, and provoked anxiety about race relations within Puerto Rican migrant communities. And many of them had settled in East Harlem, which was becoming, in the 1920s, the largest Black community in New York City, Black American community. So in this context, the meaning of citizenship became both more important and more contentious for New York's Puerto Ricans. The community of about 40,000 in New York by the late 1930s managed to elect a Puerto Rican representative to the New York State Assembly in the late 30s for 1 term. And then this was just before a massive migration stream opened up after World War II, when 40 to 50,000 Puerto Ricans a year came to the United States to fill industrial jobs, looking for economic opportunity. And at this time, most people in the migrant community, especially those who had been on the mainland since the 19-teens or 1920s, they wanted the US Congress to address the status question. The island had suffered so badly during the Depression and the kind of land grab and the intensification of the sugar industry, which meant that subsistence agriculture was essentially eradicated on the island and people had trouble feeding themselves. Truly, starvation was a massive problem in Puerto Rico in the 1930s. So there was a pretty obvious connection between the people of the island not being able to vote to protect their own interests and the US making all kinds of policies or just kind of implicit access to US investors that was damaging for the survival of the people of the island. So the status question was a really live issue among members of the migrant community too. And US lawmakers avoided these issues like the plague. There was one single US congressional representative between the 1930s and 1960s who openly acknowledged the colonial relationship of the United States and Puerto Rico. His name was Vito Marcantonio. He represented his East Harlem district, so the Puerto Ricans were his constituency, but he was just really passionate about this. This was not a transactional relationship. I mean, people accused him of that, but if you read all of his, his speeches and what he stood for in Congress beyond just the Puerto Rican constituents' interests, he was sort of committed to this honesty in the U.S. relationship with Puerto Rico. There's one other rare example of a public official who is willing to admit the colonial character of both the relationship with the U.S. and Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans' citizenship, meaning that it was a second-class citizenship. That person was the U.S. appointed governor of the island in the early 1940s, Rexford Tugwell. He was a New Dealer who was part of FDR's Brain Trust. And he published a memoir in 1947. So this was actually just after Puerto Rico had a native Puerto Rican had been appointed governor for the first time in 1946. Before that, the governors were appointed by the U.S. president. They were all, white guys from the United States. So Tugwell published this memoir in 1947, like a few years after he finished his last term. It was called The Stricken Land. It gives you a sense of the kind of themes that he explored. And he said in that memoir, we had interests, and he was speaking basically of like the 1920s and 30s and into the 40s. We had interests of which we could not let go, but at the same time, we meaning the US government. But at the same time, we felt compelled to pretend that they did not exist. It was part of the general public hypocrisy, which was naturally shared by the Congress. Americans generally had not come to think of Puerto Ricans as real citizens. Rather, when they thought of them at all, as citizens of a sort of second class. So in 1952, Puerto Rico's official status was converted from just an unincorporated territory into a, quote, associated free state or commonwealth. Really, this made very little difference in any of the either fiscal relationships or legal relationships or political relationships. Beginning in 1953, advocates of self-determination for Puerto Rico lobbied the United Nations. The United Nations had been formed after World War II, and a big part of its international advocacy involved the decolonization movement that had begun really gaining traction after World War II. So this just a few years later, a number of Puerto Ricans began lobbying the UN and arguing that Puerto Rico should be included on a list that the United Nations maintained by what is now called the Special Committee on Decolonization. But U.S. representatives, members of Congress, have kept Puerto Rico off this list of non-self-governing territories since 1953. So it's this kind of battle for honest categorization. I mean, that's how the representatives of the UN Special Committee on Decolonization would describe it. And in fact, the island status was revisited by this committee in 2016 and again in 2022, not reported in the media at all. You know, this is just a kind of like internal problem, not to be not to complicate what Americans, non-Puerto Rican Americans, understand about the island. So the U.S. Congress and the Puerto Rican legislature established a status commission in 1963 to test whether what they called a compact between the island government and the U.S. Congress under the Commonwealth arrangement, whether it was working to the satisfaction of Puerto Rican people. This was the origin of the first plebiscite, the first ballot vote on status. And there was a lot of politics surrounding that, both on the island and in the community in the United States. And this was the 1960s, the kind of radicalization of a larger number and younger Puerto Ricans was happening alongside kind of radical politics in many other areas of U.S. life. And so multiple organizations of radical young Puerto Ricans joined older nationalists, like members of the old Nationalist Party that had been founded in the 1920s, protesting this first vote of the Puerto Rican status question in 1967. I'm not keeping track of time. I forgot to look at my watch at the beginning. Only 5 more minutes? Oh, geez. Okay. Let me just go a little faster. So I won't give you details on the other on the other plebiscites. I kind of give you a little overview of what that means. In this particular one, this first ballot vote, votes for the Commonwealth, the current status, then current and still it's basically the same, won out at about 60% of the total. Statehood got almost 40%, and independence got less than 2% of the votes. And I'll say a little bit more about that in concluding. So, skipping over a little bit of commentary about all of that, some legal commentary, I want to analyze the key developments since the mid-1970s that have drastically tightened the island's colonial shackles and led pretty directly to the economic crisis that the island has been facing in the 21st century. So there's five sort of mostly legislative, but some sort of just tax codes things that I want to mention. First is in 1976, Congress amended the U.S. Internal Revenue Code, the IRS, and the amendment supported the island's economic recovery just from the period of industrial decline after what was hoped to be industrial boom after World War II that didn't fully ever happen. This was called Operation Bootstrap, which is another interesting topic. So this amendment to the tax code exempted American companies from federal taxes on income earned in Puerto Rico. The idea was to attract companies, and it did. A lot of pharmaceutical companies, some sort of light manufacturing really thrived on the island for 20 years. And I'll get to the 20-year point in a minute. In 1984, this was really important, Congress amended the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, adding a provision that excluded Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico would count as a state, just like other states in the Bankruptcy Code, other states in the U.S., for every purpose except for allowing its municipalities to invoke Chapter 9 bankruptcy. This is extremely relevant for what has happened in the 21st century. And there's a judge who was on the First Circuit Court of Appeals who argued, a Puerto Rican judge, who argued that under existing Supreme Court precedent at that time, Congress could legislate differently for Puerto Rico, provided that it had a rational basis to do so. So this judge, Lauria, said there was no plausible rational reason to deny Puerto Rico access to Chapter 9 bankruptcy. He said it was an arbitrary exclusion, and this would prove to be true. And he also said that the court was implicitly approving, and this is a quote, a colonial relationship, one which violates our Constitution and the law of the land as established in ratified treaties. Okay, so then in 1996, this is in the Clinton administration, part of the Small Business Job Protection Act of 1996, Congress approved a 10-year phase-out of the tax credit for Puerto Rico that had been initiated in 1976. So essentially that was a 30-year tax haven that was very useful for the island in like sustaining economic growth and a tax base that was extremely valuable, and you know, a lot of jobs and very little dissatisfaction from Puerto Ricans across the political spectrum. Like, this was just widely considered to be, this works, this is good. So as a result of this change in 1996, Puerto Rico lost new investments in this pharmaceutical and high-tech industries as companies withdrew their deposits from local banks. Puerto Rico's economy entered into a steady decline. The phase-out was a 10-year period, and it ended in 2006. So just before the financial crisis, Puerto Rico was facing a huge final decline in its tax base, and not to mention employment opportunities, etc. So then, jump ahead to 2014, which was basically 7 years of free fall in the island's economy. And the Puerto Rican legislature tried to pass a recovery act that would allow public corporations, especially beleaguered utilities, to restructure their debt. And this was preempted in a district court decision by the bankruptcy law from 1984. So that then was followed 2 years later in the Obama administration also by the oversight board of Puerto Rico called PROMESA, the Puerto Rican Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, which Puerto Ricans widely detest. It is a, I think, 5 or 6 person board that essentially is, this is not just governance without representation, it's austerity without representation. The PROMESA board, you know, it is outsiders, they're not, I mean, 1 or 2 members might be originally from Puerto Rico. But a lot of people on the island refer to it as a colonial junta, like just a cabal of people who, yes, they're managing the debt. The reasons for the debt have to do with the colonial relationship and the opportunities for exploiting the debt situation. I mean, there have been a sort of new surge of land grabs by what Puerto Ricans widely call gringos, especially after the hurricane, and a lot of opportunity for capitalizing on this austerity by outside investors. And it's just, you know, it's a kind of amplification of the colonial relationships that have been plaguing the island for more than a century, but especially that Puerto Ricans have been arguing to try to adjust in recent decades. So I'm just gonna, the several plebiscites that have happened So the second one was 1993 under George W. Bush. Oh no, I guess it happened under Clinton. George W. Bush sort of got it rolling, partly because of his allegiance to a former statehood party governor of Puerto Rico. And Obama and Clinton both say, they support the Puerto Ricans' majority view, but their administrations do nothing to actually prod Congress to take this issue seriously. Clinton said after the plebiscite during his presidency in 1998, he said he remained committed to implementing a majority choice for Puerto Rico's future status. Just, classic slippery statement from Bill Clinton. So the clearest conclusion to be drawn about these various ballot votes is that they represent, the outcomes have varied a lot. The different percentages for statehood is often, it's usually the plurality. In a couple of cases, it has been called a majority, but if it's like a two-part ballot question, then if 61 people are voting in the second part for statehood, that's not actually a 61% vote for statehood, that's 61% of the 54% of the people who said the current status is not acceptable. So there's a lot of opportunity for misrepresenting what these outcomes mean, but what they generally have shown is that that an overwhelming majority of the Puerto Rican people reject colonialism. One interesting thing about these opposite ends of the status debate, independence on the one hand, which is considered to be the sort of far left, and then statehood on the other, which is you're typically aligned with kind of more right-wing, Republican, US Republican-aligned politicians. So the interesting thing is that while most of proponents of these positions couldn't be farther apart in many aspects of their ideology, they share the fundamental premise that colonialism is wrong, both politically and philosophically, and it needs to be changed. So Puerto Rico is the oldest colony in the Americas. It went directly from Spanish rule to US rule in 1898. And since then, it has been engaged in a continuous struggle to achieve either independent sovereignty or constitutional equality within the United States. And nothing yet has come of that struggle. It was reported, I read this in a law journal article, I couldn't find the original source, so I'll say it as hearsay, but I think it's a great quote. The Colombian writer and Nobel laureate Gabriel Garcia Marquez was visiting Puerto Rico in the mid-1990s, and he was asked by a reporter why he had never written about Puerto Rico. And he said, "If I told the truth about Puerto Rico, everyone would say I was making it up." So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.